Peterson, and we are continuing our journey and discussion on the life of St. Francis of Assisi, and still viewing that as an invitation to walk in some of the same things that he walked in. So we've talked about what his initial call to ministry looked like. We've talked about the reasoning that he's looked at still as sort of the patron saint character of animals, and some of the wild theology and philosophy that he had around creation, and us as not just stewards of creation, but us as connected beings as a part of God's creation. We're going to talk a little bit more this week about creation and the reality that Francis walked, not just in a way that he was connected with animals and the whole of everything, but he also had healing ministry. He also had radical intimacy with Jesus. There were miracle signs and wonders that followed this character throughout the entirety of his life, and even some things that are a little bit more mysterious that he walked in that I think we get to engage with and not just write off, brush off, pretend that they didn't happen. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope this becomes an invitation. Francis was a character of humility in history almost to a fault. And I say almost to a fault because at the same time, through the biographies of St. Francis and through just the material that's available about him, we see this duality of St. Francis believed that God was still healing people. And on the one hand, he genuinely believed in a God who heals the same way that we believe that today. But he also believed himself completely and wholly unworthy of carrying that sort of a healing gift and healing anointing. And it was the humility that almost turns into something that isn't kingdom, the humility that I think sniffs around some of us today that doesn't say that we should have an accurate view of who we are, but a humility that says you should always view yourself as less than and lesser. That's a version of humility that we actually need to deal with in our hearts, because it becomes a self-deprecation that actually causes us to look less like Jesus, not more like Jesus. Sometimes our fear of pride leads us into the ditch on the other side of the road that looks like this. I'm just a worm, I'm just nothing, I'm totally valueless, and I'm absolutely worm dirt. Jesus didn't die for garbage. He died for sons and daughters. He died for a beautiful, victorious bride, and you're a part of that. And this is where I think we see a little bit of the internal struggle of the character of St. Francis in history, that he had a humility that if I were to encounter it today, it would almost smell like a false humility. It would almost smell like a fatalism. But in Francis' world, he believed that he was not worthy of carrying something like a healing anointing. And we see this shift in the first healing miracle story in the life of St. Francis. And this is, he was on a ministry trip, on a journey, and had to stay the night somewhere and was invited to stay the night with a soldier. And Francis goes into this guy's house to stay the night, and the soldier has a son who's crippled and lame and either can't walk or has a really, really hard time walking. And the family begged St. Francis to lay his hands on this child and pray for him to be healed. And Francis gave in and did it. And the kid got healed. And this becomes the opening up of a healing ministry that we see through the life of this character. That is, it's this lame boy healed. It's multiple cases of people with leprosy being cleansed. It's multiple cases of people with things like epilepsy and seizure disorders having prayer and then never having another seizure again. We see the raising of the dead even after Francis has actually died. There's some crazy stuff that goes on with there being like a power center in the life and the intimacy of this character that actually spills out and starts to have a dramatic impact on other people. So it starts with him getting over himself. It starts with him overcoming his own belief in his own unworthiness and stepping into this radical expression of healing. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. So if you're watching this and you're going, I want to see God do miracles through me. I want to see the sick healed. I want to see all this stuff happen. Sometimes the barrier to that in you is not that God doesn't want to use you. Sometimes the barrier in you is not that deep down you're just too afraid to cross the chicken line of laying hands on the sick and praying. Sometimes the barrier is actually that deep down you're believing a lie that says you're not worth it. That says that God would be better off using somebody else because you think that your sin is too great or your past is too yucky or you're not as faithful and faith-filled as you want to be. Like, get rid of that stuff. Push those lies to the side because they'll stop you from stepping in. And for Francis, he needed a kick in the butt to step in. He needed to be in a position where he was either going to walk it out or not walk it out. And I believe God in his grace and his mercy will put us in those positions where the thing that you've been asking for, you've been praying for, you've been hoping that you could step into all along is right here in front of you. Is it time to step into it now? And my prayer for you, before we go into the next little chunk of this video, my prayer for you is that you would really grab a hold of it. That faith would rise up, that if there's anything that you are believing about yourself, about the nature of God, about the nature of everyone else, that would stop you from stepping into the miraculous heritage that you have in the kingdom, that would be highlighted and removed right now. That God would show you the places where unbelief has snuck and wormed and weaved its way in, and that you could have those barriers removed and step past fully. Like, that's what my hope for you is. So I think we get to look at a character like St. Francis and say, I want what he carried, but the avenue that he walked down is not the avenue that I have to walk down. Just because his process involved what feels like fatalism, what feels like unbelief, what feels like a humility that's almost an unhealthy humility, I don't have to walk the same way to step in. He opened that door with Jesus in the 1100s, early 1200s. I can walk through that door freely because someone else actually went ahead and rose up a highway for me to walk across. And that's the thing that I really need you guys to lay a hold of here, is that we're talking about some of these historical characters, not because we're worshiping them, but because we're honoring what they carried. In the same way that I would hope that you guys could pull on some of what I carry in the prophetic in different areas, I get to, and you get to, and we get to pull on some of what St. Francis carried, even though he's dead. Because if we're being really honest, if he's part of the great cloud of witnesses, he's not really dead. And if we believe what the Bible says, we're actually seated with Christ right now in a supernatural way in heavenly places. That means that there's a part of us that's in the same room as St. Francis is. So anyway, let's shift gears a little bit now that we've just blown that thing up, and I hope you guys really get to chew on that thought process. But now that we've blown that thing up, there's a manifestation that we see in the life of Francis and a lot of people that follow him that sort of starts with him that I would be remiss not to talk about. And it's a really controversial, miraculous, mystical expression, but we're not going to dodge around it just because it's a little bit controversial. I'm going to pull up a picture here. This is some more art of St. Francis. I believe this is St. Francis laying hands and healing a leper. And we saw this multiple times in his life. The cleansing of lepers was a reality. Leprosy was still something that was not dealt with, was not eradicated the way that it mostly is in the world today. Do you notice his hands, though? If you look at his hands, it looks like his hands are bleeding. And there is a mystical manifestation of Jesus that we see hundreds of times in the history of the church. And the first more modern example of this that we see is Francis, but we have something like 500 people after Francis that have experienced the same thing. And you'll hear it called the marks of Christ, the wounds of Christ, the stigmata. There was a real spooky movie made about the stigmata a few years ago that I remember watching. It was like my first experience with this whole thought process. And if I'm honest, it sort of tainted my thinking on that whole realm. I kind of went into that place of, oh my gosh, this is like hooky, spooky, creepy, freaky, deaky stuff. Well, if we read in the history of Francis, the church was going into a place where they had for a really long time focused really heavily on the deity of Christ without talking at all about the humanity of Christ. And the church was starting to understand that we need both of these things pressed together to actually get an understanding of who Jesus is. Like if we begin to separate the humanity of Jesus from the fact that he is very God and very God, we can land in a weird place. This can actually lead us to a really, really funky, like, dual understanding of Jesus that starts to be at war with one another. And in this time period, the church is starting to grab a hold of the fact that Jesus really was human in addition to being God. He really did experience life the way that we experience life as humans. And part of that starts to come up in the art of the day, starts to depict Jesus as actually suffering through the crucifixion and not just sort of being a willing participant that isn't really experiencing anything negative in the midst of that. And this opened the door to a thought process in the church that said we should contemplate the cross in a different way. We should be really open to the fact that the cross was really hard and really difficult for people in a different kind of a way. And as Francis is meditating on and taking a prolonged amount of time focused on what the crucifixion was like and what Jesus actually went through, again, according to the historical record, he started bleeding from his hands and from his feet and from his side, and these 5 wounds actually showed up. I cannot explain this with a healthy, deep, rich theology because there's a lot of mystery here. We could argue that Paul may have experienced this, and a lot of people point at Galatians 6:17. In the NASB it says, "From now on, let no one cause trouble for me, for I bear on my body the brand marks of Jesus," the marks of Jesus. And there are a number of theologians that look at that passage in Galatians 6 and say, Paul likely had the same thing going on that St. Francis had going on. There are other explanations. This is a mystery. What I know is that through the history of the church, there have been people that have had these marks show up on their body that were later proven to be frauds. There are people that have had these marks show up on their body that were proven not to be frauds. And you guys would have to do a little digging to find the details here, but I found at least one study where in an actual scientific academic setting, someone had the marks just show up. And that started raising the question, is this psychosomatic? Is this a mind over matter thing where they believe something so deeply that it manifests in their body? Or is this actually something from Jesus? And in Francis' example, the way that he described the experience was he was meditating on the cross and what it cost and the high cost of what Jesus went through. And according to Francis, he saw an angel, and the angel came down and touched him. And when the angel touched him, he started bearing these marks on his body. I cannot explain it, but we get to engage with it. We get to talk about it. I have a hard time imagining, and I've heard people say this, it's from the devil. It's from the devil. I have a hard time imagining that the devil shows up and does something when the body is gathered together, contemplating what Jesus accomplished on the cross. I actually think that that's the one place that the enemy would really, really hate to be, would be in a place where the whole of the body has started to really contemplate and meditate what the crucifixion was. I struggle with it. But I also, if I'm being real and vulnerable and honest, I don't understand it. But I know that one of the common denominators that we see about every single character that we're going to talk about as we go on this journey together is that they had a focus on what the cross accomplished and on what Jesus went through that started to absorb way more of their reality than most people did. I know that for a lot of these characters, for a lot of these people in our history, in our heritage as believers, a lot of these people had the cross become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in their world until it became almost an all-consuming reality. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that it's necessarily bad that Francis was in a place of deep, deep, deep meditation, just connecting with what Jesus did for him. I don't know that that's a negative. I would have a hard time with that. So is this something that we should pray to experience? Again, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we're all supposed to step into that place. I'm not sure that in most cases it's even real. But we do have some pretty stark evidence for the fact that it likely was. I'd have a hard time imagining that Francis was one of the guys that faked it. But there have been 500 or so instances since then, both men and women, Catholic and Protestant, having these sorts of experiences. There's a lot of nuance here to talk about. The thing that I would point you guys in the direction of is the idea that for Francis, Jesus wasn't something that we added to our life. For Francis, Jesus wasn't something that got to be in a little box, and then on Sundays we open the box and we do our Jesus stuff, and then we put it away for the rest of the week. Jesus was all-consuming in St. Francis' world. That's probably how we should be. That's probably the place that we should be driving for. And if the call is that we would be Christ-like in a very real way, maybe that looks like healing the sick. Maybe that looks like casting out devils. Maybe it looks like raising the dead. Maybe it looks like lepers being cleansed. Maybe it looks like radical provisional miracles coming to you. Maybe it looks like preaching to animals and having the animals actually show up and listen. Maybe it looks like all of the crazy manifestations that we talked about. Maybe looking like Jesus sometimes also looks like having the wounds of the crucifixion show up on your body. I have no idea. But I know that the love of God was so present and pervasive in this character of Francis of Assisi that we should be willing to step in and to follow. We should be willing to step past and really see God in a depth and in a richness in the same way that Francis did. Now, are there things that were manifestations in the life of Francis that I choke on and I struggle with? Yeah, like with any character. You're never going to find someone that you agree with 100%. There was a focus on poverty that existed in Francis and existed in the orders that he led that I'm not sure are the best manifestation of the kingdom. And for the time period, maybe they were. Maybe that was the thing that was needed at that time, a monastic community that was so separate from the system of the world that they even swore into poverty so that they didn't have to participate in the system of the world. But that was valuable then. I don't know if it's still valuable now to the same degree. I don't know if God would call us to the same thing that he called Francis to. We get to navigate this together. We get to walk this out together. But the thing that I know that we should be able to agree on is the fact that if God called Francis to walk in miracles, signs, and wonders and healing, that door is open for us to walk through also. I also know that Francis had radical encounters with angels and with Jesus and with the spirit realm. I believe that's a mandate that still exists on his bride, and that heritage is still available to us. And I believe that the intimacy with God that Francis cultivated throughout his life is an intimacy that we get to cultivate also. So that's my prayer for you. That's my prayer for you through all of this, that the same way that intimacy was the one thing, the main thing for Francis, it should be that for you too. And if that looks like you walk in the same things that Francis walked through, I think that's available. If that looks totally different, I think that's available too. I think we get to sort this out. And I think sometimes the advance of the kingdom looks like lepers cleansed. I think sometimes it looks like people finding such a radical place of devotion that they would leave behind everything that they knew to step out into the unknown and follow him. I think sometimes it looks like a people group just getting it in a way that they're not tied up and ensnared and hung up on the system of the world anymore. And if we can get that takeaway, that's transformation in itself. If we can grab a hold of that takeaway, that's the advance of the gospel. So I hope it grabbed you. I hope Francis as a character, as a person that in a very real way is like a great-great-grandfather to us all in the faith, part of the cloud of witnesses that went before us. I hope this inspired you. I hope that this journey into this character helps you step into the unknown in some different ways. My goal is that you guys would maybe think about what it would be like to preach and have the animals gather. Maybe you'll share the gospel with some birds tonight. I don't know. I know that this is just the beginning, and that we started with St. Francis because he's a really important character in our area. We're going to talk about all kinds of wild stuff and supernatural things and miracles and signs and wonders, and we're not going to just be throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. We're going to be talking about historical people that actually lived, that actually walked in the things that the people in this book walked in, and hopefully that becomes an open door and an inspiration for us to do the same. So I love you guys. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next week on Your Supernatural Heritage, and have a great time. Be inspired, be provoked. Go after miracle signs and wonders and see what Jesus does in response to your faith. Bye.